Thank you all for joining us for our Land Use and Transportation webinar as a part of our Common Agenda Education series with the Virginia Conservation Network. This webinar will be recorded and uploaded to VCN's YouTube channel for sharing and future viewing. We'll answer any of your questions at the end of each subchapter section, so feel free to put any of your questions or your thoughts into the Q&A chat box that you see below on your screen. You will not be able to unmute yourself, so any of your questions need to go into that box. As a reminder, this is a 501c3 event and is intended as educational on strong conservation policy. While we do recognize that it is an election year, we are not engaging in conversations about specific or general legislation or bills for the purposes of our educational series. That being said, I will pass it over to Wyatt Gordon, VCN Senior Policy and Campaigns Manager of Land Use and Transportation, to kick us off.
Hey everyone, thank you for coming out. Whether you were involved in our Common Agenda briefing book process or not, you probably have an idea of looking at the final product, how much work went into it, how many really amazing, smart people poured a lot of time into explaining some of the biggest challenges and the ways we can fix them across our Commonwealth. So thank you all for not only engaging by reading that book, which we spend so much time on every year, and really informs a lot of the policy that we do, but by coming to this as well so that you can hear from those really smart people that we rely on. Because as great as we think VCN is, we're only as good as all of our partners. Today's going to be a really great event. You're going to hear from people firsthand about some of the big challenges we have. And the first section of issues that we're going to be looking at is land use and how there are things that we want to build, like good housing close to where people want to live. And then there are things that we would like people not to build so many of, like data centers. Kicking it off, we're going to have Kyle Hart of the National Parks Conservation Alliance talking with us about mitigating data center development's impacts.
Thanks, Wyatt, and thanks everybody for being here today. As Wyatt said, my name is Kyle Hart, and I'm with the National Parks Conservation Association. Today I'm here to talk about a paper in the VCN briefing book, Mitigating Data Center Development's Impacts. As I said, I work for an organization called the National Parks Conservation Association, or NPCA. NPCA is a nationwide nonprofit dedicated to protecting and enhancing America's national parks for present and future generations. And we co-authored this paper with Julie Bolthouse, the Director of Land Use at the Piedmont Environmental Council. Unfortunately, Julie couldn't be here today, so I'm kind of taking the lead, and I'm happy to be here. So very quickly, what are the challenges with data centers in Virginia? So to start, I think it's worth setting the stage. And so for those that don't know, 70% of the world's internet traffic is run through Virginia, and we have the largest concentration of data centers in the world. This comes from a lot of reasons, but mainly it's essentially that when the internet and AOL was created many years ago, 40 years ago, AOL at the time sort of chose Western Loudoun County as their hub. They started laying fiber optic lines in the region, and sort of the wheels got turning, and here we are today. This problem has sort of flown under the radar for quite some time in the sort of the environmental community. I think last year was the first year that any serious bills about sort of data center regulation or legislation were introduced and carried in the General Assembly. Last year, the community sort of was not necessarily scrambling, but sort of learning as we went, as we supported some of our champions on this legislation, and decided to really kind of dig in this summer, which led to the white paper that is currently in the briefing book. The problem is not necessarily with data centers themselves, but rather with the unchecked and unregulated sort of explosion of data center construction statewide. To put this into perspective, data centers use a lot of energy. One data center can use between 60 and 90 megawatts of energy, which is the equivalent of 15,000 homes. Currently, data centers in Virginia utilize 21% or more of Dominion Energy's load, and that's expected to rise to 40% or more in the coming years. Depending on individual projects. We are seeing these projects sort of shift out of their traditional sort of industrial bubble and into more rural areas adjacent to national parks, state parks, historic resources, state forest, and others. And we're seeing the size of these proposals just grow exponentially. The problem there is that when a proposal historically might have only used 10 or 20 acres, now we're seeing proposals as big as 2,100 acres. That's bigger than the square footprint of 4 pentagons, kerplunked right there next to Manassas National Battlefield. There are also water supply concerns. Some data centers use as much as 3 to 5 million gallons of water a day. Certain projects in Virginia have drawn ire of local legislators due to water concerns. And there's also impacts to regional electric grid. So right now, the grid supplier for sort of the region, PJM, has acknowledged that the grid is going to need to go major infrastructure upgrades to support this industry. That's new transmission lines, expanded transmission corridors, and the like, all to support the data center industry, and frankly, footed by Dominion ratepayers. So what is the solution? In right-hand corner or the right side of your screen, this is one really awful proposal called the Prince William Digital Gateway. This is a proposed 2,100-acre, 3-gigawatt data center campus. To put that into perspective, 3 gigawatts is the equivalent of like 3 Clover power stations, which is sort of the last biggest coal-fired power plant in Virginia. What is the path forward? So first and foremost, we need to have a statewide study on data centers. We're recommending in our white paper the National Academies of Science, but we would sort of be comfortable with some other independent organization. We just are strongly urging that it not be, for instance, the State Department of Energy or the data center industry itself. This study should examine things like energy impacts, grid impacts, water impacts, all of the like. The state also gives a lot of tax breaks and tax credits to this industry, so we should be examining whether or not we're getting our bang for our buck there. We would also encourage there to be some sort of state oversight of large data center applications, particularly a grid impact analysis conducted by the SEC, the State Corporation Commission, to ensure that this industry is sort of paying its fair share on the electric grid. If they're requiring massive new transmission lines or new electric infrastructure, that they're paying for that and not Dominion ratepayers. And then we're also encouraging regional review boards of large projects. Right now, it's all localities that are approving these projects and not, there's essentially no collaboration between localities. And so when one locality really likes a project and all of their neighboring communities have concerns about grid impacts or water, there is no sort of incentive or requirement for these localities to collaborate together. And so we would love to see some sort of regional review board set up to evaluate these projects and allow other localities and other stakeholders to have a seat at the table. So that's all from me. That's my contact information. Always happy to chat data centers. And that's all from me. Thanks, Brittany and Wyatt.
Yeah, no, thank you so much, Kyle. And just a reminder for folks, we're going to save all of our questions for the end of each little subsection. So if you have questions for Kyle, just drop them in the chat. We'll be gathering those so we can do that. And up next, we have Ashish Kapoor from Piedmont Environmental Council to discuss how we can deploy utility scale solar responsibly. Ashish.
Right. Hi, everybody. Can you see my screen?
We sure can.
Yes.
Great. All right. Well, thanks, Wyatt. Thanks, Kyle. My name is Ashish. I'm at Piedmont Environmental Council. I'll be talking about the Deploying Utility Scale Solar Responsibly paper written by myself, Josephus Almond at Southern Environmental Law Center, and Patrick Fanning at Chesapeake Bay Foundation. Oops. Okay. So the problem is multifold. Utility scale solar right now is going to be a significant portion of the solution for Virginia reaching its clean energy goals by 2050, according to the Virginia Clean Economy Act. We need to get 100%. So as Kyle went over very effectively in his presentation, data centers over the next 15 years are going to be a significant portion the increase in load that we're seeing. So an already kind of difficult land-intensive goal is going to become almost doubly more difficult. I should mention a portion of that electrification increase is also due to EVs and electrification of homes, but significantly coming from data centers. Just for perspective, on average, utility scale solar requires 7 to 10 acres of land for 1 megawatt. So when you're looking at, achieving 100% energy goals and a portion of that coming from utility scale solar, you're looking at hundreds of thousands of acres of land for solar. So it's imperative that we continue development, but it's imperative that we do it responsibly. So that's protecting prime ag land and forests. Once that's taken away, very difficult to get back. Thinking about the water quality impacts, majority of the compaction and impact on the land that leads to runoff and erosion issues on these projects really happens at the beginning of the projects. So really trying to limit the grading and using existing technologies and relatively nascent but growing technologies that can prevent, those 15, 20% cuts and fills that really kind of degrade the land and, prevent vegetation from taking off both in the short and long term. Thinking thoughtfully about historical, cultural, and scenic resources, battlefields, cultural resources, and really limiting siting on or near those locations. And similarly with wildlife, thinking about sort of present and future impacts of wildlife corridors, existing wildlife whose habitats are affected with that solar installation and how to mitigate against that impact. And lastly, kind of the scope of impact, but also sort of on a granular level, thinking about that construction process and thinking about the decommissioning, what happens with that land if and when this project is decommissioned 25 to 40 years down the line. Is that land usable in any sense? And again, a lot of that happens at the beginning of the project and can have a big effect. And all of this, it is also affects the future of solar in these localities. The better a project is, the less issues with runoff or construction dust or those types of issues, the more likely that locality is to encourage solar and not limit it severely with its ordinance writing, which is something that we are seeing increasingly in the Commonwealth. So just quickly, we'll focus on 3 solutions. One is selecting these sites strategically. If we think about alternatives to greenfields, that's ag land and forest. If we think about it comprehensively, we have, post-mining land, that's something in the news today in Southwest Virginia, where a lot of sort of developed land, post-mining land, brownfield land is up for development, some of which will be for energy. So kind of, stocking the brownfield fund and providing more funding to help developers close that gap for more expensive projects so we can see more of those. Parking lots, similarly, you're talking about land that's already been impacted with some sort of built asphalt. Building upon that, again, requires a more expensive installation. So closing that gap for developers can go a long way and seeing more of that development. Right-of-ways along highways, DOT's mapping that area out now, what's possible there. We've seen that in other states where those 30, 40 acre right-of-ways can also be chunked up and connected to the grid more quickly. Landfills and brownfields, as I mentioned, can impact collectively pretty significant renewable energy demand. Best management practices, I've kind of gone over most of these already. I would just mention agrivoltaics, still in its nascence, but we're seeing more of it, and that's developing, farm yield crops in conjunction with solar panels. So we want to see more trials on the state level in our climate with our crop yields and see what works. And then, that can also sort of include sheep grazing and things like that. When done correctly, can also have some future utility for that land. HB 206 is the legislation that focuses on permit by rule developments. That's anything 150 megawatts and less. And PEC, as well as SELC and Chesapeake Bay Foundation, as well as Nature Conservancy, in addition to industry groups and solar groups and utilities, have been part of these conversations over the last couple of years down in Glen Allen. So we hope to see some good good regulations coming out of that can help sort of codify some of these best practices. And lastly, comp plans and ordinance development, PEC and other organizations. We help with these ordinance planning discussions that are going on the local level, and try to guide localities. They may not have too much experience with this in the best ways that benefits them and benefits solar and its future in Virginia. And I will share my contact info here, Kapoor@pecva.org. And let me stop sharing. Thanks so much.
Hey, thank you so much, Ashish. And once again, if you have questions for Ashish on what is a very tricky topic, feel free to drop them in the chat. Up next, we have something where we're actually really excited for people to be building things in places, and we want to help people to build them in the right places, similar to the solar siting. So I'm going to pass it off to Stephen Wade with the Partnership for Smarter Growth.
Hello, everybody. Stephen Wade here, the president of president of the board of the Partnership for Smarter Growth, regional advocacy organization, education organization working on transportation, land use, and housing policy. Happy to be here to chat briefly about some ways to think about how and where we do want to grow. Ours is called Unleashing Sustainable Housing Growth. I also really want to thank Charles Yang with RVA YIMBY. I don't think Charles is on today, but he did a significant amount of this work, and he is doing a lot of great work in the region. So another expert to reach out to. Thanks, Charles. Oops. So some of the challenges we're going to talk about kind of around how to continue to move our growth patterns away from kind of auto-oriented development patterns. There's a number of reasons why this is not really working from a environmental perspective, from a racial equity perspective, environmental justice perspective. Auto-oriented development kind of on the edges and fringes of our regions. There are significant emissions from both the construction of that housing as well as the transportation to serve that housing or live in that housing. So we know there's a higher environmental impact on the emissions front. Housing that is separate and not mixed use areas, it's much more difficult to walk. So it's much less healthy for people to be able to walk and get exercise, and it's much less safe on that front. Cars are driving much faster, usually have larger distances to cross. So it's less healthy, less safe, more dangerous for having development patterns that are focused on cars. And then the cost for families. Housing is the number one cost for most households, and so even if you are to move out to the fringe because maybe you think there's cheaper housing there, which isn't always really true anymore, you're increasing your transportation costs. So any housing costs you might gain by moving further away, you're having to invest in more cars, more maintenance, more insurance, a depreciating asset. And so especially for low and moderate income households, the increase of kind of transportation and housing costs combined goes up the further out you go, and the more space you have to maintain. So we don't really see kind of an affordable lifestyle available for our low and moderate and working class families. We also know that it puts significant pressure on our rural areas, farmlands, and forests. So as we look to preserve farms, preserve farmland, preserve forests for environmental reasons, for food system reasons, for local economic development reasons, the more we frankly support and encourage auto-oriented development, the more pressure gets put on that land to sell and develop in a different way. So we're thinking about ways to kind of discourage development on the fringe, to discourage development that's auto-oriented. And so there's a number of things that we're working on, a number of things to do both at the state level and really at the local level. So really, how do we legalize and encourage denser, more compact housing in the places we do want it? A number of jurisdictions and at the state, there's talk of a policy and program called Missing Middle. This is kind of a form-based type of housing. Currently, in many of our areas, we either have single-family housing, kind of detached, or we have fairly dense housing that's multiple stories high, and missing middle tries to capture more of a kind of graceful middle density form, which both increases the supply of housing in areas. It might not be the housing that's right next to the bus stop, but maybe it's within a couple blocks of the bus stop. Accessory dwelling units are another way to increase kind of the housing supply in areas that are already built out or developed. And so thinking about all the ways we can allow multifamily housing by right. Right now, it's oftentimes in most of our jurisdictions and across the state, much more difficult to build lots of housing, to build multifamily housing. So how do we make it more, if that's the kind of housing we want and we know where we want it, we should make the rules work to encourage that type of housing. And particularly if we can incorporate affordable housing within that, the more we can incorporate affordable housing, multifamily as a by right, we can lower the cost of that development to happen, the speed with which it gets developed. And then another kind of unnecessary cost, and one that contributes to the environment and doesn't help people's health, is having unnecessary amounts of parking. And so really, the more we can lower our requirements or not have any requirements, even potentially have parking maximums, so that we can spend more of our valuable land near transit in our cities on housing people and not housing cars. That's what our environment needs, our community needs, is more housing, again, for people and beds and families, and not for cars. So currently a lot of our zoning, a lot of regulations, a lot of our financing tools, unfortunately, encourage more parking than we really need. And so along with kind of some of the land use reforms in conjunction with that, as I talked about, is kind of the cost for building and maintaining that housing. Particularly for affordable housing, we know that the market is not going to serve all the people who live and work, who want to live in our community, but maybe work in our community. And so we need resources to support not only the construction of new housing, but also the preservation of existing affordable housing. We have a decent amount of affordable housing that already exists, and the cheapest way to have affordable housing is to keep what we have. And then lastly, housing vouchers to make sure we can operate housing for those, particularly at the lowest end. So those are a couple ideas that we're really working on and excited about. Happy to answer questions. I'll be here. And again, Charles Yang is available as well too. Thanks, Wyatt.
Hey, thank you so much, Stephen. So in this section, we've touched on some really good themes of our work. How do we say yes to things? We don't want to be seen as always saying no, but how do we say yes, but this is how you do it right? And then I think also, especially Stephen, touched on some really good concepts about, we talk about this is being good for conservation, good for the environment, good for climate, but how do we make it good for people so that we're building good coalitions of affordable and abundant energy and housing? So we only have one question on this section, and it is for Kyle. From Laura Dent, who is the vice mayor of Harrisonburg. And she says, one potential solution to the energy burden of data centers that she heard at the Virginia Clean Energy Summit is microgrids. So that way data centers could be more self-reliant. Granted, the gas industry was promoting gas-powered microgrids. What is your take on microgrids?
Yeah, thanks, Wyatt. So this is certainly a complicated question, and I am by no means an expert. So I will also quickly plug, there was an energy-focused data center paper done by Dan Holmes with Clean Virginia and Will Cleveland with Southern Environmental Law Center, that they're really the experts on energy. However, I will briefly answer this question, which is, I think microgrids for this sort of concern, this energy concern, could absolutely be a viable solution on two fronts, or on sort of with two caveats. The first being, as you point out, we should be encouraging this to be carbon neutral. And so I don't think that a long-term solution to this problem is, natural gas. I think we sort of start to run into the same problems that we're running in right now, which is carbon emissions and that sort of thing. And then I think the other thing is microgrids, solar microgrids and that sort of things aren't going to be enough energy to supply, right? I mean, like one data center, like I laid out, is 90 megawatts. And, you saw from Ashish's presentation about sort of the land requirements to meet that sort of energy demand. One option that's on the table is SMRs, small modular nuclears, which is obviously very much in a test phase. Lots of money is being dumped into this right now. The governor has obviously sort of pushed this as a priority, with some pushback from the environmental community for the obvious reasons. Of course, the caveat to that is if the data center industry wanted to pursue SMR research and deployment on their own dime, I think that would probably be a very possible alternative, as long as the state is not subsidizing that, strongly encouraging it for broader energy concerns, et cetera. I think it's a viable solution, but really that's going to come down to, is the industry willing to pursue that, and how is the state going to push that? So that's hopefully a rough answer to your question. Thanks, Laura.
And thank you so much, everyone who was on our land use little subgroup. Up next, we have two more authors to share some information with y'all. First, in the transportation electrification side, we have Lena Lewis of the Nature Conservancy.
Hi, everybody. Let me share my screen. Okay. Hi, I am Lena Lewis with the Nature Conservancy, and I'm going to talk with you about accelerating transportation electrification. And I'd like to thank my co-authors, Victoria Higgins with the Chesapeake Climate Action Network, Chris Land with the League of Conservation Voters, and Blair St. Ledger Olson with Climate Cabinet. And you may know that carbon dioxide emits about half, carbon dioxide. Transportation emits about half the carbon dioxide in Virginia. And when you look at what aspect of transportation is the largest emitter, it's our personal vehicles. It's our cars, our pickup trucks, and our SUVs that are collectively emitting more carbon dioxide than the entire power sector in this state. And so we really need to address that if we are going to shift to a carbon-free economy in this state, and we need to do it quickly. The most important thing we need to do is figure out how to become less car dependent, how to reduce our vehicle miles traveled. You just heard a great example of how to do that, and there'll be other speakers in this webinar who give us other examples. But my presentation is focusing on the vehicle miles that we still travel. And those vehicle miles we need to electrify as quickly as possible. And the reason for that is because electric vehicles emit so much less carbon dioxide than their gas-powered equivalents. And so there's some challenges to making this transition quickly. And one is that, the auto manufacturers are now making many, many more types of electric vehicles at many more price points. And that's really great. They're not distributing them evenly to states across the country. Manufacturers favor sending more models of EVs at more price points to states that are clean car states. And fortunately, Virginia will become a clean car state officially in 2024. And the thing that we really need to focus on right now is building out our charging infrastructure so that people feel confident buying those EVs and knowing that they can charge their vehicles at home and they can charge their vehicles on their road trips and wherever their destinations are everywhere in the state. And this is important because EVs really can save owners and car renters money over the lifetime of the vehicle because the fueling is so much cheaper, and so is the maintenance and the repairs. And also EVs have the potential to save lives. And I mean that in the sense of public health. And it doesn't just happen when we have like 1 or 2% of the cars on the roads being electric. We'll see public health benefits for people who live on roadways when we see a large percent of the vehicles on roads becoming electric, and we'll really clean up our air pollution along roadways. So there's a real potential to see lives saved from reduced asthma, reduced heart attacks, reduced lung disease along roadways. And also in terms of building out EV infrastructure, Transitioning to electric vehicles depends on reliable, affordable, and fair access to charging. So we need to make sure that everybody can charge their vehicle as easily as they park their car, essentially. So we have several solutions here. One is to defend the clean car standards. This is the legislation passed in 2021 that allowed Virginia to become a clean car state. We expect it's going to get a whole lot of attempts to repeal this legislation in the General Assembly, so we'll need your support in defending it. We also have in this state an EV rebate, but it has no money to be distributed. So we are asking our legislators to put some money into our EV rebate program. And third, we would really like to require that any new multi-unit housing that gets built that has parking spaces, maybe doesn't need it, but if they have parking spaces, we'd like those parking spaces to be EV ready, which means putting the wiring in before putting the pavement down, because it's so much cheaper to do it ahead of time than to dig up the pavement later to put in the wiring, to put in EV chargers. Not even saying put in the EV chargers now, just the wiring. And then lastly, that we'd like to create a grant program so that EV chargers in rural and low-income areas of the state become more economically feasible, so that people everywhere can charge their vehicles. So this is where I am. This is how you can reach me. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Lena. And just again, as a reminder, any and all questions we'll answer at the end of this section. Up next, we have gone from transportation. Now we're going into where we work and live. And we have buildings that we need to make cleaner and safer for people. And one of our leaders on that work is McKenna Dunbar with the Sierra Club.
Good afternoon, everyone. I will be covering the Making Buildings Cleaner and Safer as a roadmap for our collective vision for clean building infrastructure in Virginia. This paper was co-authored by myself, Blair St. Ledger Olson from Climate Cabinet, and Victoria Higgins from Chesapeake Climate Action Network. I have worked with them before, and I'm excited to continue working with them on energy efficiency related items. But as we convene here today, we stand at a pivotal junction, at a pivotal point in Virginia's environmental and public health narrative. Our shared commitment towards sustainability, energy efficiency, and environmental justice as a whole has really pushed us on a path forward in electricity and transportation, as former presentations have conveyed. Yet there is one significant sector that does remain in the shadows of progress, and that is the residential and commercial building sector. And, you know, as Wyatt alluded to just a few moments ago, our buildings are really the lifeblood of daily life, of centers of commerce, of comfort, and how community is convened. And, you know, there's figures and statistics everywhere, but it's a matter of fact that we spend 90% of our time indoors, and with work from home increasing and more activities being held inside, it's important that we do address this in the Commonwealth, because it has more implications than just electricity and how that energy is produced in and of itself. Because, you know, as our statistics and analysis revealed, buildings are responsible for a staggering 36% of the state's climate emissions, which is significant. And this figure is more than just a statistic, than just a number. It's a stark reminder of an opportunity that Virginia has, you know, yet to seize. So, venturing deeper, we uncover the perils of methane, also known as natural gas, which is a seemingly benign energy source that fills our homes. And the dark side of this common fuel is its volatility, which leads to devastating fires and explosions. And you know, tying in some of the work that Beyond Methane RVA has been able to investigate in our over-reliance on traditional use of fossil fuels that power homes and businesses. Methane is really a key concern, and it profoundly impacts like our air quality, which is something that electrification seeks to mitigate. So our white paper doesn't just highlight statistics, it speaks to the importance of Virginia's children as well, whose breaths are shortened by the very air that they breathe in their homes, which is a sober reality, underscored by a 12% rise in asthma cases directly linked to indoor methane combustion. Seeing as Richmond, Virginia, where I'm based, Richmond, the city, has been known to, per capita to be to have some of the highest cases of asthma rates in the country, which even further exacerbates this problem on top of other social disparities. So another statistic to highlight is that some Virginian families have seen fuel factor charges that add over $35 per month to their household energy bills. And this economic narrative intertwines closely with both health and safety concerns because of methane's price fluctuations, which are also exacerbated by global events like the war in Ukraine. It has not only demonstrated the fuel's unpredictability, but has also left Virginian families facing more financial burdens, even on top of the fuel factor charges. If we go to the next slide, some of the solutions, transitioning to proposed solutions rather, we aim for not only foresight, but robustness in how we are enforcing building efficiency standards and electrification measures overall across the state. Firstly, we propose the adoption of stringent building energy efficiency standards. And this isn't just about aligning with the IECC. It's about setting a new norm for construction that inherently respects our economic, environmental, and health imperatives as a state, but also as a nation as a whole. But policies aren't only as strong as their enforcement, and thus we call for the Virginia Board of Housing and Community Development to act with conviction and embracing these standards, not as mere guidelines, but also as blueprints for a sustainable future. And then we turn our focus to enhancing local leadership, the custodians of our community's well-being. And our proposal empowers localities to draft ordinances that meet and not only meet, but also advance health and safety goals, embracing electric-only construction that sidesteps the hazards of methane, especially because we have VCA goals that we need to meet in the near future. And simultaneously, we must capitalize on federal funds from the Inflation Reduction Act and bipartisan infrastructure law to revolutionize our existing infrastructure, particularly for low to moderate income communities, as reflected in the goals of HOMES and HERA, Homeowner Managed Energy Savings, and High Efficiency Electric Home Rebate Act, which is in each pot of funding, Virginia is receiving $93 million to support electrification and energy savings for 80% AMI households. So that's going to be pivotal for transitioning off of methane and increasing resilience and reducing energy burdens for common Virginian. But we also must advocate, next slide please, for a cultural shift, one that begins with education. Next slide, please. Our vision is to launch, in general, public awareness campaigns that resonate in all corners of the Commonwealth, which illuminates the multifaceted benefits of clean energy transitions, particularly with energy efficiency measures in households, residential households. And so through targeted outreach, we can dissolve resistance, foster acceptance, build community, and catalyze change, particularly with our most vulnerable and institutionally underserved communities. So in conclusion, I know I'm getting to the time, our white paper not only presents a path forward, it weaves a tapestry of solutions where health, economics, policy, and education convene to really veer towards fostering a net zero future in the Commonwealth. And so we call on every stakeholder, anyone who's listening or will watch this recording in the future, policymakers, communities, individuals, to join hands in transforming our buildings into not only sustainable habitats, but places where health can be safeguarded. And so I do believe in redefining the spaces we inhabit in order for future generations to be able to live in a healthier and cleaner future with buildings that reflect those values.
Excellent. Thank you so much, McKenna. And we have a question from Chris Layan. So, we've heard two different goals today. One, we want lots of housing. We want housing to be more affordable in the right places. But how do we adopt IECC standards without making infill and multifamily housing prohibitively expensive to build or to occupy? Can you kind of talk about the potential trade-off there, if there is one, or ways that this might actually be a win-win?
Yeah, of course. I think, Chris raises a good question and something that a lot of developers are seeking to better understand in this clean energy transition. What are the costs associated for these energy efficiency retrofits and inclusions for new builds? I think, and this is wearing my Sierra Club hat as well, I think, their main priorities that we as an organization have related for adopting 2021 IECC for new construction. We personally believe that Virginia should be in full compliance with the IECC, either by adopting language through the 2021 IECC or by eliminating weakening amendments that are currently incorporated in the uniform statewide building code, specifically those concerning wall insulation and air filtration requirements. Going to what Lena was speaking about right before me, EV readiness is super important, and we think that new construction should have and be equipped to install EV chargers if desired by the owner. And this applies to residential structures, multifamily, residential charging, and other commercial and institutional settings. There are, and this is more specifically for affordable housing funds as it relates to the Inflation Reduction Act. There are federal monies that have been announced that are supporting developers in building energy efficient and more electrification aligned affordable housing developments for converted office spaces. And there are other commercial funding available that will be released in the future related to these improvements. So, in former calls on the commercial side, there is the question of there's increased capital that needs to be invested to really unlock the savings that developers want to in order to reduce the full construction costs to implement these energy efficiency technologies. But that's a question that we all have, and I'm sure as time goes on with IRA implementation, we'll get more information related to increasing energy efficiency. But we also believe in zero energy standards, and that the Uniform Statewide Building Code should activate and make mandatory the standards set forth by the IECC's appendices for the zero energy commercial and residential building provisions for any buildings claiming to be zero or net zero energy.
I'd like to add just one more point on that quickly, which is that affordable housing is not just about the monthly mortgage or the monthly rent. It's about all of the living expenses of living in that unit. And so if you're paying a little bit more for your monthly rent, or you're paying substantially less on your energy bill, that makes that housing more affordable. So it's really important to keep in mind, and just want to echo all the federal money available now for developers to make the housing more energy efficient.
And that, folks, is how you know that Lena also does a bunch of work on energy efficiency. Thank you for the tag team, ladies. Those were fantastic presentations. Okay, up next, we have our subsection on public transit and trains. So we're going to kick that off with Trip Pollard, who is going to be talking about how we can transform our transportation at a macro scale. How do we get more money into the things that we believe in instead of into highways? So take it away, Trip.
Thanks, Wyatt. And there we go. Our transforming transportation, as Wyatt mentioned, is sort of an overarching look at transportation and the need for shifts and changes that we need in this area in order to get a cleaner and more equitable transportation system. One thing I wanted to mention, I wrote this paper with Richard Hankins, RVA Rapid Transit, and with Victoria Higgins of CCAN. So what's the problem? The problem is we've made some really significant progress in recent years in a number of areas to improve funding and consideration of cleaner transportation modes in Virginia. But despite this progress, and progress which unfortunately has stalled out under the current administration a bit, but despite this progress, our transportation funding and policy still tend to focus very heavily on building new and expanded highways and to slight funding for cleaner and more equitable transportation alternatives such as transit, rail, and bicycle and pedestrian. So why does this matter? As was mentioned at least once already, it matters because transportation is the largest source of carbon pollution in Virginia by far. And it's also a leading source of a number of other pollutants, such as particulate matter. And these pollutants, many of these toxic air pollutants, tend to have a vastly disproportionate impact on communities of color and under-resourced communities. So in addition to the emissions problem from transportation is the fact that our current transportation system provides most people in Virginia few meaningful alternatives to driving. And so for those who either cannot afford a car or do not wish to drive or are unable to drive, it is very difficult for them to have access to jobs, housing, food, medical care, education, etc. So the bottom line is that our current approach to transportation, our asphalt-centered approach, hurts our communities, our health, and our environment. Solutions. So again, this paper is a broader brush look at solutions, and then there are papers we'll hear from in a moment about particular modes, and then as we also heard from Lena and the previous panel, once we reduce the amount of driving we do or vehicle miles traveled, then we need to clean up the remaining driving through electrification. So the overarching solutions are first, establish a goal to increase clean transportation funding share to 50% by 2030. And, again, we're not seeing a lot of progress in this area from the current administration. And we've got a long ways to go for this, but this is the goal we think where we have to shift if we're going to get to where we need to go on emissions reduction. In addition to the state funding, we need to maximize the funding for clean transportation projects under the federal infrastructure law. And of that money to take advantage and ensure that the Justice 40 initiative is followed through and that 40% of the funding goes to under-resourced and overburdened communities. The second recommendation we have, second solution, is to strengthen Virginia's fix-it-first requirements that require us to spend our road money that we spend on maintenance before we spend it on construction to take care of the system taxpayers have already paid for. So we need to strengthen that code requirement. It's okay as written, but often ignored, and to increase the actual allocation of funds to maintenance and repair. The third item deals with Virginia's transportation funding prioritization program, which is called Smart Scale. It's a nationally recognized and has been an incredibly effective tool to bring both transparency to transportation funding decisions and to bring greater funding to transit and bicycle and pedestrian projects. It is currently under review by this administration, and there are some proposals that would significantly reduce the ability of transit and bike ped projects to qualify for funding. So that is one thing we want to continue to push on, is trying to make it be as objective and multimodal a program as possible. The second item under that particular bullet is to make sure that particularly the General Assembly members don't try to end run this prioritization process through earmarks for highways in the budget. The fourth solution is prioritizing carbon reduction and transportation planning and funding. It's something we do not do a very good job of now. Many opportunities at the state and regional level to begin to shift this and make sure that our plans for the future for transportation projects do bring about an overall reduction in carbon. And the final is, I mentioned the need to reduce driving as really the kind of the step one to tackle the challenges of transportation. And so we're calling for setting a goal of reducing statewide amount of vehicle miles traveled by 20% by the year 2050. And that's what we'll need to do to be on track for our emissions reduction goals. And here is my contact information. Glad to discuss any and all of these topics with you, and thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Tripp. Highlighting a really important point that the first way for us to make progress is to stop just making things worse. So thank you for underscoring that for folks. Okay, up next, we have two sections from the same speaker, because he is one of our power players who wears two hats. So up next, we will have Modernizing Public Transit, as well as Expanding Rail from Danny Plaugher in his roles with both Virginians for High-Speed Rail and as the head of the Virginia Transit Association. So Danny, I'll just kind of let you seamlessly glide from one into the other if that works for you.
Hey, Wyatt, that does. Thank you. So a little bit, I want to thank all of my other co-authors in these papers with the Community Climate Collaborative, RVA Rapid Transit, Virginia Interfaith Light Power. This is the Modernizing Public Transportation. Get this. There we go. So,
Danny, and if you can speak up a little bit, you're just a little quiet.
Okay. Can you hear me now a little bit better?
A little bit better. You can go even louder.
Okay. The pandemic pummeled our transit systems, impacting our ridership, employee recruitment, retention, and operational cost. So that is the issue. Why does it matter? Obviously, all these different things impacted our ridership. So less ridership means potentially less revenue for some of our transit systems. Less revenue means less opportunity to put more buses on the street, more trains on the street. A lot of our both state funding as well as our federal funding. Ridership is a huge component of how much each agency actually gets. And so the less ridership that we have, the less opportunity to bring additional dollars, both transit from state and federal resources into the Commonwealth of Virginia. For less employees, no matter how great your transit expansion plans are, if we are unable to retain and grow our recruitment of employees, we are not able to expand our transit systems. If we don't have the drivers, we can't put the buses on the street. If we don't have the mechanics, we can't make sure that the buses continue to run. And so, especially during the pandemic, the retention and recruitment of new employees is a major factor. And so I know GRTC has increased the average wages for their bus drivers, given retention bonuses, and a lot of our other transit systems are following suit because they're not just competing with one another, they're competing with the school systems, they're competing with the trucks and freight transportation. They're also competing with companies like Amazon for delivery and additional drivers. And then lastly, dignified transit stops. Today, we have a large propensity of transit stops across the entire Commonwealth. Some of them are just signs and ditches. And so we need to start making transit more dignified, putting in those last foot infrastructure, the sidewalks, the streetlights, the benches, the shelters to keep folks out of the weather and make transit an equitable and equal partner to other transportation modes. And thankfully, this past session, there was a bill to start modernizing a lot of our transit stops by expanding the TRIP program. And so we're going to continue to pound that drum to make sure that transit is an equitable and dignified method of transportation. And so how are we doing this? Obviously, protecting and increasing existing funding, both on a statewide and regional approach for transit, including addressing WMATA's fiscal cliff that is upcoming, improving transit ridership by expanding service, continuing zero and low fare programs, and encouraging dense land use around our transit stops and facilities, increasing regional transit funding in underinvested areas. That is a fairly new phenomenon in a lot of places like Richmond, where the transit system mostly was in Richmond. There was a few routes in Henrico or down in Chesterfield, and bringing a regional approach to a lot of our transit systems. Expanding the TRIP program, the Transit Ridership Incentive Program, to include zero emission transition plans for our transit systems. A lot of our bigger transit systems have the ability to do these type of zero emission plans, but it's our smaller, more rural systems. They don't have the engineers or the staff or the capability to complete these plans. So expanding the TRIP program to make that one of its pillars. Expedite and streamline the implementation of last foot infrastructure that I mentioned, bus stop benches, shelters, crosswalks, and lighting. Virginia has been dealing with some challenges. Even though they do one bus stop on a street, the next one may take an entire year to go through the planning process. And so we're working with a lot of different stakeholders to streamline that process to get these investments done. There's no reason why a concrete pad for a bench, for a bus stop bench, needs to be the same thickness as a home. It can be a little bit thinner and still be just as safe for our communities. And then lastly, advocate for fair allocation of state and federal multimodal grants for transit projects. And that's a huge one as well. Making sure that we in Virginia are bringing down every dollar possible, and then utilizing programs like Tripp mentioned, Smart Scale, to make sure that they're also investing in transit projects, not just more highways and more roadways. And so moving on, Tripp was my co-author for the Expanding Rail. So the reason for this is passenger rail needs continued investment to achieve even greater ridership, train travel times, and reliability, and need to be improved. Many stations need repair and updating, and transit connections between rail stations and activity centers are frequently limited or lacking. And so why does it matter? Rail is really behind other modes in terms of investment priority. And what I mean by that is really the Commonwealth has not made our first rail investment until 2008. And so we're a little bit behind the 8 ball in regards to the amount of money that the Commonwealth has invested in rail compared to some other modes, including roadways. And so we're really kind of catching up. And sadly, we're behind the curve a little bit when you look at how clogged I-95 are and some of our other modes. And rail will help mitigate those issues and move more people onto trains. Secondly, stations, connections, and amenities were built for a declining mode. When Amtrak was created and a lot of our stations, Staples Mill, they were put in places, suburbs or suburbia, with facilities like Amshacks, with the thought that rail was a declining mode and that it would no longer have relevance in the 20th century. Well, that has proven not to be true. In fact, through September, our Amtrak regional trains exceeded their highest ridership ever, breaking nearly 1.3 million passengers for the last federal fiscal year. So here in Virginia, at least, Virginians love their trains, and it is no longer perceived as a declining mode. And so we need to start improving our stations, those entry points into our communities, the connections to our communities, as well as the transit systems that feed those, and the amenities in our stations to make sure that they're welcoming, that they're comfortable, and that folks will continue to use them and not be seen as a detriment to the overall rail system. And now's the time. Obviously, the federal government is making the largest investment through the IIJA in rail. And so now's the perfect time Virginia's investing billions of dollars through our Transforming Rail in Virginia initiative. And so it's a tremendous opportunity for the Commonwealth, not only to build off of what we've done, but take it even to the next step. And so the ways that we're looking at doing that, protecting increasing rail funding across the entire state, including implementation of the Transforming Rail in Virginia program, support the implementation of the Commonwealth Corridor, which is our cross-state corridor connecting Hampton Roads, Richmond over to Charlottesville, down to Southwest Virginia, inclusion in the FRA's corridor identification program. We should hear, the state has applied that corridor, that program. We should hear sometime in December or January whether or not it has been accepted. And essentially that puts it in the pipeline for future federal investments. We also need to fund our rail station modernization and provide multimodal connections between stations and activity centers, authorize a state study on the opportunities to expedite the transition to zero emission trains and infrastructure, fund a study on the economic and environmental life cycle and cost benefits of adding new freight capacity on rail versus roadways, getting trucks off our highways and onto the trains where they do much less harm both to our environment and to our communities, and then also protect any potentially abandoned rail corridor through public purchase and rail banking for future use. The state now owns hundreds of miles of corridors, which they didn't in 2019. And so we're continuing to make progress, but we want to make sure that we don't lose any rail corridors for future passenger rail opportunities. And so with that, that's my contact information. Thank you again, and I look forward to questions. Thank you, Wyatt.
Danny, thank you so much. Loved seeing that super young picture of you. That was really fun. Okay. We have a quick question from Richard Hankins with RV Rapid Transit. He heard that the smart scale vote got postponed to January. Is that true, Trip?
It is a possibility. It has not yet been postponed. For now, it is still scheduled for December. And I was just talking to a CTV member yesterday. That is still on for December as of now.
And up next, we have a question from Laura Dent, Vice Mayor of Harrisonburg. She shared how, she's looked through some of the changes. She was pretty horrified to see how many projects would be dropped under this, and was wondering, SELC submitted a letter and was kind of curious, what is the plan to fight back? How can people really express that these proposed changes to smart scale are counterproductive and taking us in the wrong direction? What's kind of the strategy, Trip?
Okay, I'm just seeing this. Sorry, hadn't seen that Q&A before. Laura, thank you very much for your comments yesterday. So the town hall on smart scale, the public meeting was held earlier this week, and it was actually the day before yesterday. And so there, within VCN, Transportation Land Use Group, I've been giving updates, Laura, and so folks have been engaged pretty much, and I owe people an update on the town hall from the other day, but comments period is open until November 14th. A number of members of the Commonwealth Transportation Board are pushing back against some of the most damaging recommendations from staff that are on the table. That vote is currently scheduled for early December. So the best thing for people to do is to send in comments, and looks like Laura's got the link in her question and answer. And I've got some points that I circulated to all the VCN Transportation Land Use listserv. I'd be glad to share them with others.
Okay. Thank you both very much. We are going to be moving on to our next subsection of policy papers. This one is focused on walking and biking. And kicking us off, we have Stuart Schwartz with the Coalition for Smarter Growth, and he's going to be talking about the work that needs to be done in order to save pedestrian lives.
Thank you, Wyatt. Hold on, I'll get ready to share. Okay, here we go. All credit to Sonia Brehe on our team at the Coalition for Smarter Growth, who's our Northern Virginia advocacy manager and a bike ped expert. Mike Doyle and Chris French from Nova Families for Safe Streets. Brantley Tyndall from Bike Walk RVA, and Amy Guzulaitis from Partnership for Smarter Growth. Amy was originally going to give this presentation, but she conveniently got grabbed by VDOT and Richmond DPW to participate in their Chamberlain Avenue walk audit today and tomorrow. We've done our own walk audit there, PSG has, and a report coming out on November 10th. And meanwhile, Sonia has done some great work working with Cost and others on safe streets in Bailey's Crossroads. Let me go into this. This is why it's important. I don't have the stats in front of me, but there has been a significant increase in pedestrian fatalities in Virginia and nationwide, disproportionately so. Generally, according to some studies by Smart Growth America, Transportation for America, people of color, low-income people have been much more disproportionately affected. And the most significant problem is on our arterial roads. In good news, VDOT admitted to this in a presentation which we'll share with everybody. I just got from the meeting on Monday, where they invited a number of stakeholders to talk about what they can do for safe streets. And kudos to Wyatt for helping to organize that. And we'll do some follow-up. Why, we have among the worst pedestrian fatality rates in the nation. Causes, road design, worsening speeding, larger SUVs and trucks, and increases in driver distraction have all been part of it. You may or may not have seen that VDOT has maps of the top 0.1% and 1% dangerous road corridors. Overwhelmingly, it is arterial roads. But that's not to diminish how unsafe it is still in our school zones as well. So among the solutions that the team who put this together have talked about are redesigning the Virginia Driver's Manual to put an emphasis on bike ped safety. And just about any of us have seen drivers using bad habits, things that we learned when we learned to drive that were not things to do. And apparently people have forgotten about all of this or have never learned it. Allowing local authority to lower speed limits on state-controlled roads and ped areas. I understand that there were some problems with the previous legislation that needs to be fixed, and to expand that authority to more jurisdictions in more places. Establish a pedestrian safety corridor program. I think this would apply very well to cases of their most dangerous roads and arterials. And prioritize ped safety, ongoing update of Smart Scale, where Tripp and the team are doing their best to ensure that this is in the safety category in Smart Scale, and to protect what we're all doing to try to protect the other investments that would be bike ped investments as part of Smart Scale. And lastly, allocate 10% of state surplus fund to road safety infrastructure improvement projects, specifically to road design. Interestingly, the Northern Virginia Transportation Commission letter that will be voted on tonight actually very much specifically calls out arterial road redesign as something that they want Smart Scale prioritization to still cover and to emphasize, which is huge progress. Just for a quick side note, on our meeting on Monday, when we pressed VDOT on what sources of funding they would use for pedestrian safety, they said the Highway Safety Improvement Program, the matching program that they've started at the state level, and I asked for any others, including flexing dollars from highway programs. They wouldn't admit to that, but they said jurisdictions can use their revenue sharing funds, where local jurisdictions have to match 50%. So those are some of the sources they'll admit to. They haven't admitted to using Surface Transportation Block grants or National Highway System Program grants. But that's a quick summary, and I'll stop sharing and look for any questions you guys have.
Hey, thank you so much, Stuart. Moving on from walking to biking, we have Jim Durham with Virginia Bicycling Federation.
Thank you, Wyatt. And thank you, Stuart. Many of the things Stuart just mentioned apply to bicycling. So my name is Jim Durham. I'm the advocacy director, the advocacy director for the Virginia Bicycling Federation, a 501c3 nonprofit. And I want to thank my co-authors, Desiree from the Virginia Interfaith Power and Light, and Alan Munchnick, fellow board member with me on the Virginia Bicycling Federation. You've heard a lot about the issue of transportation sector, and so bicycling is a component of addressing that. The fundamental issue that we're working on is to reduce greenhouse gases from the transportation sector. An essential component of that is to reduce vehicle miles traveled, as Lena mentioned earlier. But we know that transportation electrification alone is not enough. And so our goal is to shift more trips to bicycling. And for that, we need bicycling in Virginia to be safer. We have 5 policy solutions. The first 2 are funding related. Traditionally, to date, the smart scale program of process of allocating transportation funds has been a very important source for jurisdictions to accomplish and fund their bicycling and pedestrian projects. We strongly support and advocate for retaining that objectivity and transparency that has made that successful in the past, as Tripp had alluded to. The second item is that our trail program, which I believe you're going to hear about next, there's probably a backlog of a couple $100 million worth of trails that are needed in the Commonwealth for both transportation and recreation. And so we are advocating and seeking the dedicated funding to start filling that gap and clearing that backlog. There are proven safety measures that have been adopted by other states, such as the safety stop, also known as the Idaho stop, which has been adopted by 10 states so far. And we are seeking legislation to implement those proven safety measures. The next item is that the Virginia's bicycling policy plan is woefully out of date. It doesn't account for and recommend use of the more recently proven safety measures. The good news on that front is VDOT has agreed to take on that update, and we expect to be working with them next year to make sure they do incorporate the latest proven safety measures. Last but not least is establishing the equitable e-bike rebate program. This item has been proven in the places where it's been adopted to result in more people bicycling, as well as people bicycling shifting their modes. So in other words, taking more bicycling trips rather than car trips. It'll help part of that reducing vehicle miles traveled. The equitable part of this is I just want to emphasize, we really recommend it be point of sale. So that there's not an initial outlay by which you get a rebate months or weeks later, but a point of sale rebate. And we also recommend allocating at least half, if not more, of any available funding to people living with low income or living in disadvantaged areas. So unlike the acceleration of electric vehicle adoption through funding a policy, we're asking for both the policy to establish a program as well as the funding once that policy is adopted. And that concludes my presentation. I'd be happy to hear from anybody who's interested in working on this. And again, I want to thank all the folks at VCN for the help and feedback with this. And that's all I have, Wyatt. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jim. Okay, so you love walking, you love biking. Where do you want to do it? How about some great trails? So talking about how we can get consistent support for trails is Elliot Caldwell with the East Coast Greenway.
All right. Oh, you can't see me. That's unfortunate. Hold on one moment. I am bad at doing 2 things at once. Sorry. All right, let me go. Start video. There we go. There I am. Apologies. Sorry about that. And start the slideshow. All right, there we go. So ensuring, go back. And I should Sorry, I'm not always good with the technical stuff here. How do I hide that? Well, I'm just going to go there. All right. Ensuring consistent support for trails. Elliot Caldwell, East Coast Greenway Alliance. Really want to thank Kat Anthony and Justin Doyle and Brantley Tyndall for their support in helping write this, especially Kat, who sort of walked me through a lot of the sort of longstanding state policy issues. I'm newer to working in Virginia, so much appreciated to them. And I think the title kind of gives it away, which is that we do have support for trails, but really in the state of Virginia, in the Commonwealth, but we really want consistent support and continued support in a multitude of ways. So what's the problem? What's the issue we're looking at here? We've got a multitude of, despite the sort of the multitudes of benefits that trails provide, that does not seem to be controversial in Virginia. They are still inaccessible to many communities, and really the state isn't doing their part to build trail fast enough to meet growing demand, and to meet growing demand in a variety of places. So why do trails matter, right? They're essential transportation. They form a backbone of community health in terms of providing safe places for people to bike, walk, and roll. And then in a number of places in the Commonwealth, they really do provide a tourism opportunity, or a sort of a tourism and outdoor destination and economic opportunity for a number of different folks, not just heads in beds and business owners, but also entrepreneurs who want to create businesses along trails. So, access to trails for transportation, the key quote really is access to trails for transportation, health, and recreation should not be zip code dependent. Right now, some communities have ways of building trails that other folks may not have access to. And really, we want to see a more equitable dispersion of trails throughout the Commonwealth. So what are the solutions here? 5 sort of general solutions we're looking at. And we have this VDOT Office of Trails that has been, that came out of, I guess, 2 sessions ago and has been ongoing. They're really starting to get going now, doing the state trails plan and doing some kind of outreach and sort of, reaching out through a variety of ways to residents and organizations in the Commonwealth. But we really want to see dedicated funding to that state trails office. So $41 million a year for not just construction, but also planning and maintenance of trails in the Commonwealth. $1 million for grant matching funds for low-income communities of color, and smaller localities with populations under 25,000 for better connectivity. And that's, again, both transportation and recreation trails, or ones that sort of accomplish both, to be administered by VDOT. The third one is really important, which is the state trails office right now is really one person, and really we need to fill out the remaining full-time staff positions to really increase the capacity, or to meet the capacity and then maybe add capacity later on. Establishing a state trails designation program and directing resources towards marketing Virginia's trail system. This is really important in that the state trails office is really a planning body, or it's a planning effort at the moment. But we really want to see something at a sort of a state level to designate trails and to have localities, counties, regions be able to sort of market what they have there and sort of be a part of a official system that's very public and not just sort of on the back end in terms of planning. And then $1.5 million in state-derived trail funding for DCR to match federal recreational trails grant program funding. So again, the emphasis on the state trails office is much more on multi-use trails. Those can be natural surface, they can be paved, but I think relative to more recreational trail oriented trail funding or trails, there needs to be at least $1.5 million for communities to have matching funds for the trails they're working on, that may fall outside of some of the trails that Office of Trails is talking about. So a lot going on the trails front. A lot of the solutions that were mentioned in the 2 previous presentations really impact trail use as well, and that includes like lowering speed limits. Right, we know that trails, when they cross roads, particularly arterials, we want those speed limits to be lower than they probably are at the moment. So that really supports a lot of those things that Jim talked about and Stuart talked about. They support development of trails. They support safety of users on trails. And sometimes we focus so much on building it, we stop talking about the users, but ultimately the users and the potential users are really the most kind of important part of the whole process. So here's my contact. Feel free to reach out, and pardon if I went a little bit long on that. Thanks.
Elliot, question for you. The Secretary of Transportation is notoriously hostile to trails. Do you have any knowledge of if some of those open positions in the trails office are being filled, or is this, is the promotion of one of the people to a higher level, is that kind of a strategy to weaken this office?
That's a great question. There may be other folks on sort of the call that have a better sense than I do. I don't really know the answer to that question. I mean, I know they've been taking applications for that other position. I don't really know where they are at in the process. But yeah,
as long as they're taking applications, that's a good sign.
And I'll say this: I think the work being done by the staff that are there is pretty amazing, and I think the previous 2 nights and then continuing tonight with the forums they've been having regionally with VDOT, I've actually been really, really excited and encouraged that a lot of VDOT staff who we've worked with closely, both in Richmond, but also in the regions, are on those calls and seem enthusiastic about the state trail planning process. So that's a good sign. I think a lot of the staff at the regional level are actually engaged, and we want to make sure to keep them engaged and, again, move towards more staff at the mothership in Richmond to, keep this work going.
Okay. Great answer. Thank you so much, Elliot, Jim, and Stuart, all of our authors in this section. And now I will pass it off to Brittany to let y'all know about some upcoming VCN events where you can get even more engaged on everything that we're up to.
Thanks, Wyatt. Thanks to all of our amazing authors. Let me share this view. Thanks, Wyatt, and thanks to all of our amazing authors for their time and expertise. If you look in the chat, I sent out a set of links to purchase a hard copy version of our 2024 Common Agenda. We are accepting registrations now for the General Assembly preview. Join one of our regional watch parties across the state or tune in online to prepare for the General Assembly process on Saturday, December 2nd from 9 a.m. until 12 p.m. In-person attendees will be provided breakfast and have the opportunity to network with their local advocates after the main program finishes. If you're interested in advocacy, the first step you should take is getting to know who your legislators are and contacting them. You can find yours at Who's My Legislator at virginiageneralassembly.gov. That link is also in the chat. You can share this recording and find previous recordings on our YouTube channel. And then finally, check out our Take Action page to see upcoming events in our network and access free publicly available guides, including our General Assembly Advocacy Guide, where you can find a General Assembly 101 training video, an overview of Virginia's legislative session, and a common FAQ about Virginia General Assembly session process. And then lastly, Danny has an update about an event from Virginia High Speed Rail. If you want to hop on, Danny, and tell us all about your wonderful event. I put that link to register also in the chat.
Yeah, and can I share my screen, Brittany, real quick?
Yes, of course.
Just briefly, thank you, Brittany and VCN. On Monday, we have a virtual town hall with Kara Oldheiser, Director of Sustainability for Amtrak, and Laura, who's the Net Zero Program Manager at Amtrak. They're going to discuss Amtrak's net zero and sustainability plans. It's Monday at 1 o'clock. It's virtual. You can register by going to vhsr.com and look up events, or vhsr.com /town hall 2023, and you can register there. But I hope everyone will join us and learn a little bit more about how we're making our Amtrak trains and passenger trains even more environmentally friendly. Thank you again, Brittany, for allowing me to share.
Yeah, thanks, Danny, and thanks everyone. And listen to Stuart and vote, vote, vote. Remind your friends to vote. Thanks for joining us today, and we will see you all next time.